Hello, in this video I'm going to be talking about common argument forms that are used with unstated conclusions. Deductive arguments with unstated conclusions are not necessarily valid. They might be valid, they might be invalid, either way. So in looking at truth functional arguments in which a conclusion has been left unstated, we might be looking at a valid argument or we might be looking at an invalid argument. I'm going to work through 3 problems from practice problem set 3-11 in this video, and then do another video in which I work through 3 additional problems. In practice problem set 3-11, we're going to want to do a variable assignment for each passage, use those variables to translate the stated parts of the argument, that is, the stated premises, and then see how those stated premises match up with the common argument forms. And then that will tell us which argument form we're looking at, which in turn will tell us what the pattern of the conclusion must be. Let me start first with number 2. This has to do with the Republican presidential nomination for the 1860 election. Abraham Lincoln's opponent in that nomination campaign was Salmon P. Chase, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time. This quote says, "If Lincoln could carry the military vote in the next election, he would be electable. And if he was electable, then he and not Chase would be nominated." All right, so we've got 2 premises presented there, presented as a conjunction, but we can take them apart and just understand them as 2 separate conditionals. Let's start with the one that said if Lincoln could carry the military vote in the next election, he would be electable. We'll get 2 variables from that. I'm letting P stand for Lincoln could carry the military vote in the next election, and I'm letting Q stand for he would be electable. Then after the comma, I'm sorry, not after the comma, that'll get us the entire first premise. If P, then Q. P introduces the antecedent, and the antecedent goes before the arrow, so the first premise in this argument is P arrow Q. Next, skip over and we have another conditional that says if he was electable, then he and not Chase would be nominated. Well, if introduces the antecedent, which is he would be electable, but now we're going to need more variables. Let R stand for he, meaning Lincoln, would be nominated. And let's S stand for Salmon Chase would be nominated. And then the consequent of this conditional is R and not S. So putting that inside of parentheses, we have R ampersand negation sign S. Okay? So here are the stated parts of this argument, the premises, in other words. If you look at the 7 common argument forms, you'll see that these premises correspond to the structure of the premises in chain argument. They're both conditionals, and what they have in common is that the consequent of one of the conditionals is the antecedent of the other conditional, and that's the chain argument pattern. Well, in that pattern, you see then the conclusion, how we form that. It's a conditional. We get the antecedent of the conditional conclusion from the antecedent of that premise, and then we get the consequent of the conditional conclusion from that premise. So the conclusion that was left unstated here is that if Lincoln could carry the military vote in the next election, then he and not Chase would be nominated. All right, that was number 2, and I want to turn now to number 4. I gave you a little context to help you understand why someone would give the argument that is at the end of this passage. It might kind of seem weird if it was pulled completely out of context. There is more than one argument in this passage, but the one that we are going to use to work on is the bold-faced underlined one at the end. Here, the writer says, people assumed I was a lesbian because I was more masculine than the average girl. I was masculine, therefore, and then she has ... I spent a long time trying to figure out if I were a lesbian because everyone else thought I was. It took me years to settle the question in my own head, which I did by having the stunning realization that you need to want to have sex with women to be a lesbian. I didn't, therefore, ... Therefore, ... obviously letting us know that she expects the reader to figure out the conclusion on their own from her premises. The first premise is you need to want to have sex with women to be a lesbian. You need to. In other words, it's a necessary condition. What's a necessary condition? Wanting to have sex with women. And a necessary condition is a consequent of a conditional. So we're going to understand this first premise as if I was a lesbian, or if I am a lesbian, then I want to have sex with women. Let's get two variable assignments from that. I want to have sex with women, and I'm a lesbian. And again, understanding that first premise conditionally would be if I'm a lesbian, then I must want to have sex with women. In other words, Q, arrow, P. Then she says, I didn't. In other words, she didn't want to have sex with women. So that's negation sign P. There are her stated premises. And if you look at the common argument forms, you'll see that this corresponds to the modus tollens pattern, which is as follows. One premise is a conditional. The other premise is the negation of the consequent of the conditional. And then in modus tollens, the conclusion is always the negation of the antecedent of the conditional premise. So that's the negation of Q. In other words, the conclusion that she's leaving for the reader to draw is that she's not a lesbian. All right, now I want to move to, let's see, number 5. This was from an ad for Olay, the makeup company, in Cosmopolitan magazine. And it says, the female duck has a dull, colorless hue to camouflage her body. You are not a duck. You doesn't really mean anybody specific here. It's kind of whoever happens to be looking at the ad is being addressed as you. In the first premise, it says, the female duck has a dull, colorless hue to camouflage her body. Now, in order to understand the general principle being expressed in that premise as having any relationship to the second premise, which says you are not a duck, we're going to have to understand it as a conditional premise and put the general principle in terms of the specific case, in terms of, in other words, you. Let's have one variable stand for you are a duck. And then the second could be you have a dull colorless hue to camouflage your body. Understanding that first premise conditionally, that would mean if you're a duck, then you have a dull colorless hue to camouflage your body. So P, R, O, Q. The second premise says you're not a duck, which is the negation of P. So here are the premises of this argument. And if you look at the common argument forms, you'll see that this conforms to the pattern in denying the antecedent. One premise is a conditional. The other premise is the denial or negation. Denial is just another word here that means negation. The denial or negation of the antecedent of the conditional. And then the conclusion is the negation or denial of the consequent. You do not have a dull colorless hue to camouflage your body. This is an invalid argument pattern. And again, that's denying the antecedent. All right, I hope this has been helpful, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye-bye.